The Persian Gulf's northern reaches narrow toward the Shatt al-Arab waterway, like a geographic argument made in slow motion over 10,000 years of sedimentation. The water shallowing, the coastlines converging, the navigational lanes compressing until the effective maneuvering room for a deep-draft warship becomes measured not in nautical miles, but in hundreds of meters of usable channel. It is here, in the upper Gulf, where the water is rarely deeper than 30 meters, and the Iranian coastline is never farther than 40 nautical miles to the north, that the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy has built its most concentrated forward defensive architecture. Not a defensive architecture designed to hold ground, in the conventional sense, because there is no ground to hold on open water. A defensive architecture designed to deny, to make the cost of presence in this water unacceptable, to demonstrate, through the credible threat of massed coordinated, cheap violence, that the upper Persian Gulf belongs to those who are willing to flood it with enough boats and enough munitions to exhaust any opponent's willingness to absorb the losses. The U.S. destroyer had transited into the upper Gulf 61 hours earlier, assigned to support a diplomatic mission that required a visible American naval presence within the Gulf's northern operating area. The kind of presence that serves a political function independent of any specific military task, communicating through the physical fact of a warship's location that the United States has the capability and the intention to operate in contested water, regardless of what any coastal state claims about access rights. The transit had been planned, coordinated through the appropriate diplomatic channels, and executed openly. It was not a covert operation. The destroyer had been tracked by Iranian coastal radar from the moment it cleared the Hormuz approach corridor, and its position had been known to IRGCN command elements continuously throughout the 61 hours of its upper Gulf presence. 61 hours of being watched. 61 hours in which the IRGCN had the destroyer's patrol pattern, its approximate speed of advance, its geographic boundaries of operation, and its relationship to the coastlines that bounded its maneuvering room. 61 hours to plan. The intelligence picture in the 48 hours before the engagement had been specific in ways that the watch team had discussed openly during their rotation briefings. Elevated communications traffic between IRGCN speedboat bases along the northern coastline. The network of small harbors and coastal inlets that the Revolutionary Guard Navy uses as its primary operating infrastructure for fast inshore patrol craft. Increased surface movement in the shallow water areas east and west of the destroyer's patrol area. The kind of movement consistent with assets positioning rather than routine patrol cycling, and from sources whose collection method placed the information in the category of highly reliable. A specific indicator: the activation of 2 Noor anti-ship missile battery sites along the Iranian coastline at bearings that placed the destroyer within their effective engagement range. The Noor is a domestically produced Iranian anti-ship missile derived from the Chinese C-802 airframe, a sea-skimming weapon that approaches its target at low altitude and high speed, radar-guided in its terminal phase, with a warhead sufficient to cause significant structural damage to a vessel of destroyer class. The Iranian Coastal Defense Network deploys Noor batteries at multiple sites along the Gulf coastline and has done so for years. But the activation of specific battery sites, bringing the systems from standby to operational ready status, is a distinct intelligence indicator that does not occur routinely as part of normal maintenance cycling. 2 batteries activated, both covering the destroyer's patrol area. The intelligence was not ambiguous. It was a preparation. The commanding officer had gone through the threat assessment the previous evening with his department heads and had made the decision that would later be examined and re-examined in the after-action review process, to remain on station rather than withdraw. The diplomatic mission had not been completed. The withdrawal of the naval presence before the mission's conclusion would have carried its own consequences, political, strategic, and precedential, that the commanding officer judged more damaging than the operational risk of remaining within range of an adversary that was demonstrably preparing for some form of action. He had reported the intelligence indicators through the chain of command, had received confirmation that his assessment was understood at the 5th Fleet level, and had held his position. At 4:11 a.m., the IRGCN executed. The attack opened from the east. Not with the Noor missile batteries, those came later. in a sequence that reflected a more sophisticated operational design than a simple simultaneous mass launch. What opened from the east at 4:11 a.m. was boats, fast inshore attack craft, Noor. The fiberglass-hulled, outboard-powered platforms that the IRGCN deploys in numbers precisely because they are cheap enough to lose and fast enough to close a tactical gap before a surface combatant's crew can fully respond to the threat they present. The Eastern Group numbered 9 boats. Their approach from a bearing that placed them emerging from the radar shadow of a small coastal island feature approximately 23 nautical miles east of the destroyer's position. They had apparently been staged behind the island during the night, their low radar profiles and the island's terrain clutter keeping them off the surface search picture during the pre-dawn hours. 9 contacts, moving fast, bearing 097 degrees. The surface warfare officer called the contact report at 4:11 a.m. and 18 seconds. By 4:11 a.m. and 40 seconds, the Combat Information Center had generated contact classifications, and the TAO had the picture. By 4:12 a.m. and 8 seconds, the TAO had the engagement authorization from the commanding officer, and the 25mm deck mount covering the eastern arc was slewing to bearing. What the Eastern Boat Group was doing, the TAO would understand in the next 43 seconds, was not attacking. It was fixing. The 9 Eastern boats were closing at maximum speed to a range that would force the destroyer to commit its Eastern Arc weapon systems to the threat, turning the crew, served weapons, and the deck mount to the east, and creating in the process a degradation of coverage on the western and northern arcs that was the actual objective of the Eastern Group's movement. At 4:12 a.m. and 51 seconds, 12 additional contacts appeared on the surface search radar from the northwest, not from behind an island, from a bearing that placed them emerging from the shallow water coastal area along the Iranian coastline itself, having apparently transited from their staging position at speeds low enough to remain below the detection threshold of the surface. Radar's small contact discrimination algorithm. Throughout their approach, moving slowly through a radar environment so cluttered with ambient surface return that 12 slow-moving fiberglass boats could position themselves undetected at a range of 17 nautical miles, simply by not moving fast enough to distinguish their radar return from the random variation of the sea surface clutter. 12 contacts from the northwest, 9 from the east. 21 total surface contacts closing simultaneously from 2 separate bearings that place them on approach vectors, separated by approximately 80 degrees of arc, not 340 degrees of all-aspect approach geometry, but a more focused 2-axis attack that concentrated the threat along the destroyer's port and starboard arcs simultaneously, forcing the ship's weapon systems to divide their coverage between 2 active threat axes rather than concentrating on one. The TAO recognized the geometry instantly. The Eastern Group was the feint. The Northwestern Group was the primary attack element. The Eastern boats were there to hold the ship's Eastern Arc weapons engaged, not necessarily to reach the hull, but to prevent those weapons from being repositioned to reinforce coverage against the northwestern approach. It was a simple tactical design, not sophisticated in concept, but effective in execution, because its effectiveness depended not on the quality of the individual platforms, but on the coordination of the timing and the exploitation of the human tendency to respond to the first threat perceived, rather than the primary threat intended. He called the geometry to the commanding officer in 4 words: feint east, attack northwest. The commanding officer made his decisions in the next 30 seconds. The 25mm eastern mount would hold its arc, but engage only contacts inside 1 nautical mile, conserving its fire against the feint group and forcing them to close to a range where the engagement was unambiguous rather than expending ammunition against contacts whose purpose was to draw fire at long range. The 25mm western mount and both CIWS systems would prioritize the northwestern approach. The crew serve stations on the port quarter would provide overlapping coverage against contacts that broke through toward the stern from either approach vector. And then, at 4:14 a.m. and 33 seconds, the Noor battery to the north fired 2 missiles. The launch signatures appeared on the electronic warfare system's threat receiver as a distinct pair of fire control radar activations. the Noor batteries targeting radar illuminating the destroyer for the 2-second active emission burst that the missile seeker needed for initial target designation, before switching to semi-active terminal guidance. The EW officer called the missile warning before the radar picture had time to develop the inbound tracks. The warning came from the emission detection rather than from the radar track, which would take additional seconds to appear on the surface radar picture. 2 anti-ship missiles inbound from the north. 21 fast attack boats closing from the east and northwest, all simultaneously. The TAO had 1 interceptor architecture available against the Noor contacts, the SM-2. The ship's SM-2 inventory in the VLS cells was loaded specifically because the threat assessment for Upper Gulf operations had rated the Noor coastal battery network as the primary high-end threat requiring interceptor response. 2 SM-2 interceptors were in ready fire status. 2 missiles inbound. The math was the minimum acceptable. Both SM-2 interceptors launched at 4:14 a.m. and 52 seconds, 17 seconds after the EW warning. The delay attributable to the time required to confirm the inbound tracks on radar, build fire control solutions, and execute the launch authorization sequence. The 2 SM-2s left the forward VLS cells in a 1-second interval, their exhaust columns driving through the pre-dawn darkness as the ship's hull transmitted the launch vibration through the deck plates into the bodies of everyone standing in the CIC. On the eastern arc, 9 fast attack boats had closed to approximately 3 nautical miles and were continuing inbound. The 25mm eastern mount had not yet opened fire, following the commanding officer's hold directive. 3 nautical miles. 2.5. The boats were moving at approximately 35 knots, their hulls half airborne on the plain in the flat water of the Upper Gulf. Visible on the infrared camera feeds as white bow wave signatures streaking across the dark surface toward the ship's starboard side. The crew of the eastern 25mm mount was watching them come. Holding. On the northwestern arc, the 12-boat group had closed to 4 nautical miles and was accelerating. They had been holding to a slower approach speed during their transit from the coastal staging area, and the acceleration now indicated that the coordination timing for the simultaneous assault had been reached. They were committing. The first SM-2 interceptor reached its assigned Noor contact at 11 nautical miles. Clean intercept. The contact's radar return collapsed from the distinct, coherent profile of an active sea-skimming missile to a scatter pattern consistent with major structural failure, then disappeared. The second SM-2 was 30 seconds behind the first, tracking the second Noor contact on a converging intercept geometry that placed the intercept point at 9 nautical miles. The guidance solution held. Second intercept confirmed. 2 inbound Noor missiles. 2 SM-2 intercepts. Both contacts eliminated. But the SM-2 VLS cells that had just fired were now expended, and the electronic warfare system was registering a new emission signature from the north. Not the Noor battery that had just fired, but a second battery site, 4 degrees west of the first, whose targeting radar had just activated. The first battery had fired its initial salvo, and the second battery was initiating its engagement sequence. The second battery launch came at 4:16 a.m. and 9 seconds, 4 additional Noor missiles. The EW system counted 4 separate seeker activation signatures in rapid succession. The TAO called for SM-2 from the aft VLS cells. The ship maintained a split VLS loading with SM-2 in both the forward and aft cell groups specifically for this contingency. 4 aft SM-2 interceptors launched in a 2-second ripple. The engagement overlay on the CIC display showed the 4 intercept geometries building simultaneously as the Aegis system computed the intercept solutions at speeds that human calculation could not approach. The mathematics of 4 simultaneous intercept solutions against 4 inbound sea-skimming contacts running at low altitude over a cluttered radar surface was not trivial even for the Aegis processing architecture, and the combat systems officer was watching the processing load indicators. With the same focused attention he had applied to the thermal management issue in previous engagements. Not yet at the warning threshold, but climbing. 3 of the 4 aft SM-2 intercepts connected cleanly. The 4th SM-2 missed its assigned contact, a guidance geometry error induced by the target's terminal phase altitude drop. The Noor contact descending to approximately 3 meters above the surface in the last 4 nautical miles of its approach, and the SM-2's fusing system failing to detonate at the miss distance. The surviving Noor contact was now inside the SM-2 engagement envelope, inside 15 nautical miles, closing fast. The CIWS forward mount acquired it. The contact was fast, significantly faster than the surface drones or the fast attack boats that the CIWS had been tracking on the other threat axes. The CIWS surface engagement mode against a sea-skimming missile is a more demanding tracking problem than the same engagement against a drone, because the missile's speed compresses the engagement window, and its low altitude places it close to the sea surface return that partially masks the contact's discrete radar profile in the tracking solution. The forward mount engaged at 2.1 nautical miles with a sustained burst. The contact's radar return changed, not disappeared, changed. The burst had hit the contact but had not achieved the structural kill that would cause immediate airframe disintegration. The Noor continued, its aerodynamic performance degraded by the impact of multiple 20mm rounds, but its propulsion and guidance systems apparently still functional. The forward CIWS mount tracked and re-engaged. On second burst, contact eliminated at 1.4 nautical miles. The disintegrating airframe's momentum carried its debris forward on the original approach bearing, the fragments impacting the water surface in a line that ended approximately 400 meters short of the hull port bow. The debris field was visible on the forward infrared camera as a brief pattern of impact splashes on the dark surface, already dissipating in the ship's forward wake as the vessel continued its course. During the 41 seconds that the Noor engagement had consumed, the fast attack boat situation on both arcs had progressed significantly. The Eastern 9-boat group had closed to 1.2 nautical miles. The commanding officer released the hold on the Eastern 25mm mount at 4:16 a.m., and the mount opened fire at 1.1 nautical miles, engaging the lead boats in the group with the direct, visible fire that the short range made possible without radar assistance. The lead boat in the eastern formation was struck at approximately 800 meters and lost headway, beginning to take on water. The second boat attempted to pass the stricken lead boat on its port side and was engaged as it cleared the obstruction. Third boat braking left. Fourth boat braking right. The coordinated approach geometry of the eastern group was dissolving. The individual boat crews, operating under the stress of watching their lead elements taken under fire, with the physical reality of the engaged boat's fate visible to them on the water, were executing the individual survival decisions that supersede coordinated tactical doctrine when the tactical doctrine has stopped producing survivable outcomes. Some boats were accelerating to attempt to close the range before the mount could re-engage them. Some were breaking formation to increase targeting complexity. The net effect was a loss of the disciplined approach geometry that had been the Eastern Group's intended tactical contribution to the engagement. 2 more Eastern boats were stopped by the 25mm mount before the remaining 5 broke off their approach and turned north, accelerating back toward the Iranian coast on courses that placed them inside the 12 nautical mile territorial waters limit within approximately 6 minutes. They would not be pursued. The Northwestern Group had not broken. 12 boats, now at 2.2 nautical miles, still closing. The starboard CIWS mount and the port 25mm mount were both engaged against the Northwestern contacts, the CIWS working the contacts at ranges between 2 miles and 800 meters. The 25mm mount engaging contacts that had broken from the main group and were angling toward the ship's bow sector at shorter ranges. The engagement was dense, loud, and physically felt throughout the ship. The combined firing of 2 major weapon systems simultaneously produced a vibration in the hull that was not the clean, directed resonance of a missile launch, but the sustained mechanical percussion of automatic cannon fire, a sound and a physical sensation that transmitted the violence of the engagement to every crew member aboard, regardless of where they were in the ship. 6 Northwestern contacts were eliminated by the CIWS and 25mm engagement between 2 miles and 900 meters. 3 contacts broke north, abandoning their approach. 3 contacts pressed through. 3 boats, inside 800 meters, still closing. The crew served .50 caliber stations on the port quarter and the starboard bow engaged the 3 remaining contacts simultaneously. The ranges were short enough that the targeting was optical. crew members visually tracking the boat's bow waves against the water, placing fire into the hull sections at waterline, watching for the change in behavior that indicated the engine or the hull had been compromised. One contact was stopped at approximately 450 meters. A second contact lost headway at 310 meters and began turning in a slow circle that indicated catastrophic engine failure. The third contact, the last remaining active threat in the engagement, did not stop. It was moving at approximately 20 knots when it passed 200 meters from the ship's port beam, angling slightly toward the hull as if the craft's steering had been damaged but its engine was still functioning. The port conserve station placed sustained fire into the contact's stern section as it passed. The contact's engine compartment was struck. The craft's speed dropped from 20 knots to approximately 8 knots over the course of 3 seconds, its bow dropping as engine thrust died and hull drag reasserted itself. At 140 meters from the hull, 140 meters, the craft stopped making way entirely and began to drift, its hull taking on water through the damage the conserved fire had inflicted on its waterline. 140 meters. The drifting craft did not present a further threat. It was stationary, visibly compromised, its crew not visible on the infrared feeds. The post-engagement assessment would conclude that the craft had been crewed by 2 personnel and that both had sustained injuries from the conserve fire that had disabled the engine. The craft drifted slowly south on the current and was recovered by an Iranian coastal patrol vessel 40 minutes after the engagement ended. At 4:19 a.m. and 44 seconds, the surface search radar picture showed no active threat contacts. 8 minutes and 33 seconds. 21 fast attack boats and 6 Noor anti-ship missiles engaged across 2 simultaneous threat axes. 0 hull impacts. 0 flooding. 0 personnel casualties. Weapons expenditure. 6 SM-2 interceptors. 1,900 rounds of 25mm. Approximately 3,800 rounds of 20mm. CIWS. And several thousand rounds of .50 caliber. Combined defensive expenditure, approximately $18.2 million. Estimated cost of the IRGCN attack package, boats, Noor missiles, staging and coordination infrastructure, approximately $4 to $6 million. The ratio was roughly 3-to-1 in the defender's favor, far closer than the 50-to-1 ratios of drone engagements. The IRGCN's operational design had not depended on the attack being cheap. It had depended on demonstrating that shore-based missile systems, combined with coordinated boat swarms, could force a U.S. destroyer to expend a significant fraction of its SM-2 inventory in a single engagement, leaving it tactically diminished for any follow-on operation until a logistics rendezvous could be arranged. This was not an accident of the engagement outcome. It was the designed objective. The Noor missiles were not expected to hit the destroyer. They were expected to consume the SM-2 interceptors, and they had. 6 SM-2 interceptors gone in 8.5 minutes. A logistics rendezvous required before the next patrol cycle. The IRGCN battery sites assessed as reloaded within 72 hours. The cost of presence in the upper Gulf had been demonstrated and paid, and it would be paid again by the next ship assigned to operate there. The water in the upper Persian Gulf carries no record of what crosses it. The men and women who held the watch carry that record instead, in the specific, irreducible knowledge of what 140 meters looks like from the deck of a ship when something designed to reach the hull did not quite get there. They held. The line held. And the line will have to be held again.